Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Kaohigashi from the JACL team. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the second event in our community series. I do want to briefly mention that this session will be recorded, but we will ensure that the breakout rooms are not included in anything we upload. What is being recorded is strictly the presentation itself. And then for folks who are just joining us for the first time, I believe we will be putting a PDF of the previous presentation in the chat so folks can reference that if they need. So yeah, by way of brief introduction and purpose, JACL is one of the oldest civil rights organizations in the US. And part of the reason for this conversation series on anti-Black racism is because of what has been happening on a national scale and what has exploded in the wake of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Charleena Lyles, Manuel Ellis, and many, many others. So in this context, we at the Seattle JACL felt it was really important to begin this series of conversations really as a means to take responsibility and to promote solidarity. So as we welcome you to this event, please enter your name, your pronouns, and then the name of someone who inspired you with their anti-racism work. We'd also like our JACL Anti-Blackness and Black Solidarity team to reintroduce themselves. So if folks could give their name, pronouns, and then someone who inspired you with their work. And we can just go ahead and go in order of the names on the slide.
Sure. I'm Kyle Kanoshta, he, him pronouns, Seattle JCL board member, identify as Japanese American Sansei. And the actually plural people who inspired me are people like some of the ones you see on this slide, Yuri Kuchiyama, and many of the other Nisei women who took stands against racism, including Aki Kurose and my mother, Cherry Kanoshta, who actually worked very hard for redress.
Thanks so much, Kyle. My name is McKenna Asakawa. My pronouns are she, her, and I am on the Seattle JACL board. A person whom I respect for their anti-racism work is Regent Brown. Regent is the Director of People and Culture at my company called Enviro Issues, and under Regent's leadership, we are moving toward becoming an anti-racist organization. So I have such deep gratitude for Regent's work and vision and really insistence to continue centering humanity in all that I do. I'll ping over to Mieko.
Hi everyone, my name is Mieko. I, she, her pronouns, and I am part of the National Youth Student Council, which is part of JCL National. And someone I really respect for their anti-racism, or somebody who made me think a lot differently about Asian American identity and the American racial landscape, is Kathy Park Hong. She recently published a book called Minor Feelings, and it talks about the positionality of Asian Americans in what is traditionally thought of as kind of a black-white dynamic and how we fit into that system. So I will pass it to Gabrielle.
Thanks, Mieko. My name is Gabrielle Kazuko Nomura Gaynor. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a longtime member of Seattle JACL. And I am really inspired by the current Black Lives Matter activists in Seattle, including Nikita Oliver and Chrissy Shimizu. And I will pass it to Jess.
Hey everyone, my name is Jess Wanich. I use he, him, his pronouns. A group of people that I respect for their anti-racism work is the Gang of Four. So Roberto Maestas, Bernie White Bear, the late Bob Santos, and Larry Gossett. They were really important in pushing for advocacy for marginalized communities here in Seattle. And I'll pass it to Emily.
Hello again. My name is Emily. I use she, her pronouns. Someone who has really inspired me, I'm not sure she's super active anymore, but is Mary Masuda. She's a lawyer and a critical race theorist, and she has done a lot of amazing work around really unpacking how the law has constructed and defined race and assigned value to race. And I think her work is really important. And I'll pass it to Hayen.
Good afternoon. My name is Hayen Park. My pronouns I use are she and her. And someone that I respect for their anti-racism work nationally has been Frank H. Wu. He's a professor of law, and he wrote the book Yellow: Race in America Beyond Black and White. And the person here in Seattle that I miss dearly, but also respect for her anti-racism work was Ruth Wu, who was kind of a political mover and shaker behind the scenes here in Washington State. And I will pass that on to Emma.
Hi everyone, my name is Emma Yamaguchi Sullivan. I go by she, her pronouns. And someone I really respect, I'm lucky to work under is Christina Shimizu at the Wink, but also respect her a lot for her work with Decrim Seattle. And I think that concludes our introduction, so I will pass it on to Jess.
Awesome. So first, I'd like to acknowledge that we are speaking today on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people, and the liberation of our community as Japanese Americans, as Asian Americans, is dependent on Indigenous sovereignty and on Black liberation. So before we get started into our content, let's center ourselves and ground ourselves on the land that we're on. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, Snohomish, Duwamish, and Indigenous peoples of our local area. As well, we acknowledge the experiences of genocide, forced relocation, ethnic cleansing, and land theft, so that we can build our awareness of how racism and settler colonialism have impacts that exist to the present day. We honor the resurgence of culture, economy, and way of life of tribal nations of our local area. As community members, we resolve to learn from these realities so that we can work toward a more just society. And whether you're joining us from Seattle or elsewhere, we invite you to learn more about the occupied territory on which you reside and the Indigenous people connected to the land. And a great source that we have here in Seattle is the Real Rent Duwamish website, and you can learn more in the link that we'll provide in the Zoom chat below. And passing it over to Emily.
Thanks. So we have planned a series of 4 sessions, and we'll probably plan more. The first 2 are about the roots of anti-Black racism and whiteness. The third is about how Japanese Americans and the larger Asian American community have moved from a racial underclass prior to World War II to the mythical, quote, model minority, and how this has really created a fertile ground for anti-Black sentiments to grow. Our fourth session will be about how the JA Seattle community has acted in solidarity with Black activism and adopted parallel strategies and approaches to address anti-Asian racism. These traditions are a foundation for today's activism in the JA community. And in our series, we will also be discussing the question of how can the JA community show support and solidarity with the Black community in combating anti-Black racism? And how can we achieve justice in the form of reparations and other demands? Next slide, please.
So our agenda for today is as follows. We're going to give a brief recap introduction in which we talk about the purpose of our series, and we'll be going over some conversation guidelines as well. And we'll also be stopping to allow for community conversations and breakout rooms with these 2 suggested questions in bold. So the first is, what are instances of anti-Black racism which you have seen in the Japanese American or Asian American community or your own experience? And the second question is, how does this account help you better understand whiteness, anti-Blackness, and the model minority myth today? Next slide.
Hi, so I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're doing this series and what these sessions can accomplish and what they cannot do. So one piece of feedback we got from our first session is that folks would like more practical advice and takeaways for confronting anti-Blackness, and we definitely want to serve you, our community, with these sessions. However, I do need to stress that, you know, this work is deeply personal. We can't make you experts on dealing with racism, and this discomfort that you feel when you don't have all the answers, however, can actually be an asset. Use it. Let it fuel your lifelong journey of learning and anti-racism. In the interest of transparency, I do want to mention that our planning committee is made up of non-Black Asians, and white supremacy means whites at the top, people like us, our committee, somewhere in the middle, often towards the top, and Black people at the very bottom of society. Ultimately, it's not our perspectives that should be centered in this work, but we're doing these sessions because we know that too often the burden of anti-racism is placed on our Black and Indigenous siblings, some of whom are also Japanese American. Remember that mixed race Nikkei are not necessarily mixed with white. We do this work in order to get our house in order so that we can show up confident in our role as accomplices in the movement for Black lives. So today is about reconnecting with your own personal and unique journey of anti-racism, wherever you are in that journey. And I wanted to share 3 big picture questions that I come back to that help me stay focused, nourished, and accountable in this work. So number 1 is, how are you prioritizing your own racial healing? If you are Asian American, you live in a society that was not created for you. You may possess a racialized body and identity that at times is rendered invisible, at other times has been fetishized, emasculated, or transformed into a mocking caricature. How are you working on your own self-love and healing? As people of color, investment in our own healing is a powerful form of resistance. Prioritizing your healing is going to involve speaking up and setting boundaries at times, which is not easy to do. But remember that we cannot show up for others with love and solidarity if we don't first have that love and compassion for ourselves. Number 2, are you being honest with yourself about how you benefit from this rigged system? Be aware of the racial dynamics within a room, workplace, or whatever space that you enter. Nikita Oliver, they, them, a Black mixed race activist, talks about yielding the floor in city council meetings to their more melanated siblings. And we too should be careful about when we're centering ourselves as Japanese or Asian Americans and when we need to be quiet and engaged in deep listening. Number 3, whose comfort and emotional safety are you prioritizing? If you're doing this work of anti-racism, you are eventually going to find yourself in a place where you feel yourself getting defensive. Perhaps this will come in the form of a call out or call in, or maybe just something you read or see that makes you feel defensive. It's natural to react this way, but it doesn't have to own you. Try and take a moment to just observe that feeling of defensiveness without judgment so that you can get back to the place of listening and compassion. When we start with self-love as our foundation, it's easier to understand inherently that other people's lived experiences, other people's truths are not a threat to us. So back to why we're doing this, it's important to understand the roots and histories of anti-Blackness in our community so that we can confront the issue within ourselves and find revolutionary solutions with this knowledge as a community. This is why we're progressing through these sessions the way we are. And additionally, I wanted to remind you that your questions and responses, like in our post-event surveys, will help inform how we shape our upcoming sessions with these webinars and programming moving forward. So I invite you to stick with us, stay curious, ask questions, and come back to that place of compassion and humanity for yourself and for others often in order to remember why this work matters so much. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Gabrielle. That was, I think we all have a lot to sit with and think about, and I appreciate that. So to all of you, we want to thank you again for attending today's program. Just a quick reminder that we are recording the program today because we had some requests to record last time. So you can choose to have your video on or off. Again, a reminder, we will not be recording and making available the discussion portions, so that will stay private. But we did want to create a space with this format that we could see each other's faces and all be in this together. So we do encourage you to turn on your video if you do feel comfortable. All of our guests are muted today, but you have the ability to unmute yourself during the discussion portions. Also, if you'd like to pin our speaker Kyle today so that the video is always large, just click the 3 dots at the corner of his video and click pin. We also want to remind you that we, starting today, have closed captioning available. So to make closed captioning, or to turn on closed captions, you can click the 3 dots at the bottom of your screen that say next to the button that says more, and click show subtitle. And then finally, we encourage you to interact with us and drop questions in the chat. Hannah is going to be monitoring the chat for us throughout the program. So we'd love to interact with you there as well. And then moving into the conversation guidelines, we did go through these at our last session, but we wanted to just do a quick reminder as we progress in our discussion series with today's program. So we acknowledge that this is a space where we welcome both old friends and new friends, and we hope that we can grow our relationship together through this program. So welcome to all of you who are joining us for the first today. Our long-term relationship management strategy is rooted in the strength of our relationships, both past, present, and future. And so we will maintain intentional dialogue with our attendees before, after, and throughout this discussion series. We are so grateful to each of you for being an important part of our community and for starting this journey of learning with us. As we make new connections, we will work to create an intentional and accountable community, and we look forward to having your involvement in that. We recognize that we're limited in our ability to do deep trust-building work over the course of just one program, and so for that reason, we are committing to this continuing discussion series and are offering these conversation guidelines in place of a trust-building and group agreement process. Please use these guidelines to help frame your expectations and boundaries for personal engagement in this event. And I'm just going to read through these really quick. So first of all, take care of yourself. Please take the space you need in order to care for yourself and stay centered, whether that looks like turning off the camera, taking breaks, lying down, staying hydrated. Do whatever you need for yourself through this program. Secondly, what's said here stays here, and what's learned here leaves here. Please do not share people's names and stories without their consent, but please do share what you've reflected on and learned from listening to others. Move up and move back. If you're someone that tends to share a lot, maybe think about practicing listening. If you're someone that tends to listen more, think about practicing sharing. Share joy in conversation and lift each other's up. If someone says something you love, lift it up and celebrate what they're saying and bringing to the table. You can do that in the chat or maybe just to them directly. Share joy in this conversation. Let's see. Be mindful when you are processing new thoughts and feelings. Stop and consider who's in the room, what your impact might be, who is best to process your thoughts and feelings with, and maybe take a moment to write down your thoughts in a journal. We recognize that active listening is also a form of participation, that disagreement over ideas happens and is okay. We recognize that we may experience discomfort, but we will practice curiosity and self-reflection and an openness to learning. Speak your personal truth rather than speaking for the group as a whole. And we recognize that these discussions are a journey and may not end with a sense of closure. And again, just a reminder, don't hesitate to put your questions in the chat. And we also will have a post-event survey where you can help us, inform the content as we move forward through these discussions. And next slide.
Thank you, Emma. So I've been charged with our planning group to continue the deconstruction of whiteness and anti-Black racism and how it plays out in the Japanese American community. I'll be presenting both this time and the next 2 sessions, as well as using a little bit of video to actually help illustrate some of my points. So especially for those folks who weren't here last time, just a very, very brief recap of what we talked about. Last time, we actually dug into the deep roots of anti-Black racism, going all the way back to the 1600s when the first African-American slaves were brought here. And we did a couple things. we saw and explored the fact that this thing that we call race is actually an invention, a uniquely American invention that actually wasn't around until the 1700s. It's a social construct, and it was a concept that was used to justify things like ownership of other human beings, as well as the theft of land from others, just at a time when the American founding documents declared all men are created equal. It was a way to explain the fact that there are some residents in our country that were not treated as equals. Went through the fact that early America was built on the backs of African American slavery. In fact, almost the large part of the early American economy was based on slavery and the cotton that was produced and the immense wealth that was developed. We talked about the fact that the desire to expand slavery drove the land theft and genocide of Native Americans, and it drove the conquest of Mexican land and the dispossession of millions of Mexicans in the first half of the 19th century. With the Civil War and the ascendancy of the Northern industrialists and industrialization driving manifest destiny, there was a desire for cheap labor. And with industrialization of railroads and agriculture, the waves of Asian immigration began to work these industries. This is the context where many of our ancestors came to this country. So, in the history since that time, the development of brutal Jim Crow system in the South, the segregation of African Americans in the North prior to World War II, anti-Blackness flourished. But the question is, did it go away with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? I think we know the answer. It did not, but it's really essential to understand why. And the thing of it is that unless we understand this, it will be really difficult to combat anti-Blackness in the Japanese American community. We have to understand the larger picture and the larger context of anti-Black racism in this country. So, just to warm us up a little bit to our subject and to activate some of your experiences, I'd like to go to our first short breakout for 10 minutes. And I'd like to talk to your community members. What are the instances of anti-Black racism that you've seen in the Japanese American or Asian community, or from your own experience? So we'll take about 10 minutes before we take our deep dive into anti-Black racism today. So I believe McKenna is going to put us into breakouts for 10 minutes.
Thanks, Kyle. Yep, I'm about to open the breakout room, so you'll be automatically placed there.
So in any case, I'd love to say that an hour and a half, we could give you all the answers to understanding and combating anti-Black racism. But I'll be pretty blunt, that would be pretty ludicrous and impossible. We could do 10 of these sessions or 20 and not, understand everything. But I think today we can give you a few key ideas that will help you understand, make connections, and, think about how we can combat it in any context, not just the Japanese American community. So to explain, I first want to take a minute, kind of a sidebar, to illustrate the anatomy of the racism that we'll be exploring. I thank various anti-racist organizations, such as a group called Race Forward, who devised some frameworks to help categorize and make sense out of the kinds of racism that exist and how they kind of work together. The framework I'll introduce also explains how we in Seattle JCL are organizing these workshops and why they're structured the way they are. So in their framework, they say that, in the broad galaxy of racism, you can group them kind of in three ways. And I'm using an analogy of a tree, by the way. I tried to find an uglier tree because we're talking about racism, but unfortunately, the clip art, the trees are all kind of pretty, so sorry. So the first kind of racism that they talk about is individual and interpersonal. This is the kind that we're probably most familiar with just on a person-to-person basis. This is the one that is most often talked about in workshop discussions around anti-Blackness. Individual and interpersonal racism, lots of people want to talk about it, and rightly so. It's very visible, kind of like the top part of the tree. Our Seattle JACL workshop series, starting with session 5, is going to dive pretty deeply into this subject. Now, we would be dealing with things like microaggressions, internalized oppression, and also talk about how it translates into activism. The kind of workshop that you'll see, it'll be a little different from the one that we're doing now. It would be where us as presenters would probably not talk very much and let our stories and processing and conversations dominate. It's where practical actions are talked about. And it's an incredibly important activity. But the reason, however, we're not limiting our understanding of racism to this area alone is because there'd be a danger of us thinking that all we have to do is change our attitudes and language and racism would be solved. I think most people in the conversation here know that that's not the case. So there are the other two kinds of racism, institutional and structural. They're the deeper forms of racism. And in titling our series, we intentionally use the word uproot to describe what we want to do. To uproot, it means that dealing with the top of the tree won't work. We realize that we have to expose and attack anti-Blackness at its poisonous roots. The deeper kinds of racism are the institutional, structural, or systemic kinds of racism. And our first two episodes, this last one and this one, deal with anti-Blackness from a historical perspective. We go down to the very roots of anti-Black and other kinds of racism, how this tree developed as a seed from the very first days of the development of this country. And it's really kind of individual and interpersonal racism sits on top of these two types of racism. And that individual and interpersonal racism really wouldn't survive without these roots. But like the tree roots, they're not very visible and they're covered up under the surface. It's clearly, though, the more malevolent and life-altering racism that you'll find here. What is especially sinister about these types of racism is that they're accompanied by a gigantic narrative that are kind of like the dirt that covers up the roots. The narrative comes in many forms, and you could read books about it, but it boils down to the one central storyline, that Black African Americans themselves are responsible for the situation they find themselves. That, in many ways, is the essence of the anti-Black narrative and anti-Black racism. So, this is definitely not the case, but unless we dig to uncover the roots, the anti-Black narrative in our society is so prevalent, you'll always be sort of susceptible to the idea that social stratification isn't really caused by white supremacy, but by BIPOC themselves. It's like if you don't deal with the roots, the parts of the tree will keep growing back, even if you get rid of the visible parts. You don't have weapons to counteract this narrative. And for us, the Japanese American community, the racist narrative in our community will remain intact. So this kind of workshop where we're kind of dealing with the roots, the intention is to frame the future conversations about identity and action. This also kind of explains why the first 4 workshops are more about presenting information and educating than community dialogues. Yes, this is content heavy, but it's on purpose. We want to expose the lesser known roots of racism so we have a common base of knowledge to talk about identity and action and some of these other parts. So, deeper parts of racism. Like a real tree, the deeper forms of racism have a lot of roots that nourish the system. And I want to take a look at, we could dive into all of these and spend a lot of time in all of them, and they'd be worthwhile conversations. to understand how racism works. We're going to take a look at just one example, probably a lesser known one, that maybe helps to illustrate how racism works. And this is a form that actually kind of helps explain and create a lot of the other ones as too. And it's basically the history and story of the means of acquiring basic personal wealth. And that is pretty essential to understanding why is it that we have a really privileged white middle and white upper class, and why do we have the stratification that we do? It's just one aspect, but I think it would be interesting to get into just as a way to help explain the deep roots of racism and who is really to blame for racial stratification. So to start us off, just like we did last time, I'm going to give you a two-question quiz just to know how much of the subject you know about. So, two questions are this. What is not an example of a government racial preference program? And, you know, if you listen to Fox News, you would say, yes, racial preference programs are very bad. You know, they're just giving things away. So, which is not an example of a governmental racial preference program? A, Civil Rights Act, B, Homestead Act, C, Naturalization Act, D, Federal Housing Administration, or E, the Social Security Act. And number two, the 120 billion in home loans underwritten by the federal government between 1933 and 1962, what percentage went to white homeowners to buy that house, which is probably one of the main sources of wealth for many families? 45, 64, 75, 88, or 98%. Okay, as was before, the answers to these things are hugely revealing. Answer to question one is A, the Civil Rights Act. The reason why it's not a government racial preference program is because it made certain racial behaviors illegal. It was aimed at stopping certain racial behaviors, such as segregation, etc. But all the rest of these are all example of racial preference programs, but they're racial preference programs for white people. So these are some of the examples. The Homestead Act, for example, gave away free 270 million acres, what used to be Native American land, almost all of it to whites. The Naturalization Act, of course, our community knows a lot about it because only free white persons, and after the Civil War, people of African ancestry were allowed to be naturalized citizens, of course, barring many people from our community. The FHA made it possible for millions for white Americans, but not others, to own a home. And we'll talk about that in the next item. The Social Security Act that we know today in 1930s specifically exempted two occupations, farm workers and domestics, most of whom were non-white. So question two, I'm actually not going to answer because you know, the rest of the presentation, or a good chunk of it, will actually talk about that, and hopefully you can get the answer to that. So here's where I'm going to rely a little bit on the video because they can do a better job than me explaining the story behind it. But let me set up my 13 minutes of video. So basically, modern whiteness is characterized by the great middle class affluence that developed in the post-World War II period. It's a story of doors opening for whites and doors systematically being shut for BIPOCs. If it's even acknowledged at all, the stratification is accompanied by the myth that this occurred because of individual racists, you know, in government industry. But the truth is much more sinister. To illustrate, again, I'll show a few video clips, but our brief account starts at the end of World War II. After the Great Depression, the US is the only big allied country that didn't suffer major devastation in World War II and who had billions to invest overseas, was about to enter a period of massive prosperity that characterized the last half of the 20th century. Now, in these videos, kind of a trigger alert, you'll find portions that are annoyingly cheery. And the reason why, that's sort of 1950s cheery, the reason why they're there on purpose, because it's an illustration that both the uplifting of a privileged class as well as exclusion of BIPOC communities was not done at gunpoint, but it was done with a smile and a song. So if you give me half a second here, I'll switch over to this.
Kyle, thank you for all of this. Just a reminder, there's a little bit of feedback from your microphone. So folks have just been mentioning that. Just wanted to make sure to flag that for you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try and, actually I'm going to buy a mic mostly because it's a problem I haven't quite solved. Okay. So again, these are two excerpts from the video series Race to Power of Illusion, which is incredibly informative from California Newsreel. Well, the first snippet is about 7 minutes.
It was called Levittown. Tax dollars helped make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item.
Hopefully everyone can see this.
The American dream had a new name, suburbia.
You have to remember the people who came here in 1947, 1948 were young ex-GIs whose uppermost concern was taking advantage of the GI Bill and making things better for themselves.
Before moving to Levittown, Herb Callisman and his wife Doris lived in a cramped attic apartment in New York City.
And when we began to look for an apartment, we found that the apartments were $100, $125, $150 a month. I know that's unbelievable today, but it was too expensive for us. And out here in Levittown, the mortgage payments was $65 a month.
They say your kitchen dazzles every eye. A brand new sink, a built-in oven, a new refrigerator, and a...
If you were buying a Levitt home in 1947, 48, 49, 50, and 51, you would get, this would be your kitchen. You would get a GE stove, GE refrigerator, and a Bendix wash machine. It would be part of the real estate.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
It was as though it wasn't real. You can't imagine. But for someone to come out and actually tell you that they can't sell to you, you know, I was really on an up, man, look at this house. Can you imagine having this? And then for them to tell me because of the color of my skin, I can't be a part of it. The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even 1 or 2 non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized the national appraisal system, where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
The racial logic adopts the principle that an integrated neighborhood is a bad risk, is a financial risk, that an integrated neighborhood is likely to be an unstable neighborhood, unstable socially, but therefore also unstable economically.
When the white residents of 8 Mile Road in Detroit were told they were too close to a black neighborhood to qualify for a positive FHA rating, they built this 6-foot wall between themselves and their black neighbors. Once the wall went up, mortgages on the white properties were approved. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government underwrote $120 billion in new housing. Less than 2% went to non-whites.
I can understand an individual, depending on his environment or his family or whatever, being racist, but for your country to sanction it, give him tools to do that, there's something definitely wrong there.
I think we had the golden chance after World War II, and we flubbed it, because here we had a GI Bill that was supposed to, that was available to everybody, but in a way they didn't make it available to everybody, and that was a golden opportunity in this country, and we missed it. We really missed it.
You can always tell, can't you? A town with good real estate people is a more substantial community because more people own their own homes. That's right.
And now it's sort of hard to believe that the federal government nationalized and introduced redlining. In a funny way, it wasn't just giving something to whites, it was constructing whiteness. Whiteness meant, as in the past, whites had meant being a citizen and being a Christian. It now meant living in the suburbs.
So another 6-minute snippet actually talks about the consequences of what happened as a result of this. Okay, do people see this? Good.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today 5-bedroom house is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth. And on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
So if you can get a government loan and with your GI Bill, your newly earned college degree, and buy a house in an all-white area that then appreciates in value, that then you can pass on to your children, then you're passing on wealth that has all been made more available to you as a consequence of racist policies and practices. To the child of that parent, it looks like my father worked hard, bought a house, passed his wealth on to me, made it possible for me to go to school, mortgage that house so I could have, relatively debt-free college experience and finance my college education. How come your father didn't do that? Well, there's some good reasons why maybe your father had a harder time doing it if you're African American or Latino or Native American.
And the thing that's really slick about whiteness, if you will, is that most of the benefits can be obtained without ever doing anything personally. For whites, they're getting the spoils of a racist system, even if they're not personally racist.
To glimpse one of the far-reaching consequences of racial inequality, you need only consider one statistic: comparative net worth or wealth. If you add up everything you own and subtract all your debts, what's left is your net worth.
Today, the average black family has only 1/8 the net worth or assets of the average white family. That difference has seemingly grown since the 1960s, since the civil rights triumphs, and is not explained by other factors like education, earnings rates, savings rates. It is really the legacy of racial inequality from generations past. No other measure captures the legacy, the sort of cumulative disadvantage of race, or cumulative advantage of race for whites than net worth or wealth.
Even with the same income, white families have on average twice the wealth of black families. Much of that difference lies in the value of their homes. But what happens when we compare families along the color line who have similar wealth?
When you make the right comparison, when you compare a black kid from a family with the same income and wealth level as the white kid from the similar economic situation, rates of college graduation are the same. Rates of employment and work hours are the same. Rates of welfare usage are the same. So when we're talking about race in terms of a cultural accounting of these differences or a genetic accounting of these differences, we're really missing the picture because we're making the wrong comparison.
We want to be a colorblind society that values the content of character over the color of skin. The hope of thousands of newcomers who arrive each year is that we already are.
Back to the presentation. I think the consequences of, this actually public policy are predictable, but still shocking. You have charts like these that you can find in many websites. And for example, this one is the one that just strikes me between the eyes, which is median wealth of white families versus Latinx and African-American families. And as you can see, this dates back to about 1963. 1964 was the civil rights movement. And what do you see? And by the way, median means that, if you had a fourth grader here, they would tell you median means if you took the very richest person and the very poorest person and you found the person in the middle, that would be the median. So what's happened since the civil rights movement? We can see that as wealth accumulated, as the economy progressed in the US, these are the differences. And so whereas that gentleman in the film talked about 8 times, at certain points of our recent history, it's grown to 12 times. And this is not getting any better with the change in the economy from manufacturing to mostly service and high tech, to where high tech and service is accessible to those who already have privilege or those who are already acculturated. So this is the system that we live in, which continues, the stratification. So the point that I was trying to make is kind of summed up here, that racism today is not one which has whips and guns, et cetera, to enforce it. In fact, there's a network of racism that exists in systems that very quietly reproduces the same racial stratification year after year. And it doesn't become visible until you push back on it. When you push back on it, that's where the gloves come off and the riot batons come out. So far, this has been a bit of a academic kind of look at racism, but racism, in fact, impacts millions of families in ways that are incredibly devastating. So my last video snippet before we kind of break is from Kimberly Jones. Some of you may have seen this over the summer of her standing in the devastation of a protest. Somebody put together a little bit of a documentary form that really tells what this is about.
When you have a civil unrest like this, there are 3 types of people in the streets. There are the protesters, there are the rioters, and there are the looters. The protesters are there because they actually care about what is happening in the community. They want to raise their voices, and they are there strictly to protest. You have the rioters who are angry, who are anarchists. And then you have the looters. And the looters almost exclusively are just there to do that, to loot. And some people are like, well, those aren't people who are legitimately angry about what's happening. Those are people who just want to get stuff. Okay, let's say that's what it is. As long as we're focusing on what they're doing, we're not focusing on why they're doing. Let's ask ourselves why in this country in 2020, the financial gap between poor Blacks and the rest of the world is at such a distance that people feel like their only hope and only opportunity to get some of the things that we flaunt and flash in front of them all the time is to walk through a broken glass window and get it. That they are so hopeless that getting that necklace, getting that TV, getting that phone, that's their only opportunity to get it. We need to be questioning that why. Why are people that poor? Why are people that broke? Let me explain to you something about economics in America. Economics was the reason that Black people were brought to this country. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. If I decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds, I didn't allow you to have any money, I didn't allow you to have anything on the board, I didn't allow for you to have anything, you don't get to play at all. Not only do you not get to play, you have to play on the behalf of the person that you're playing against. You have to play and make money and earn wealth for them, and then you have to turn it over to them. And then we played another 50 rounds, and everything that you gained and you earned was taken from you. That was Tulsa. That was Rosewood. Those are places where we built Black economic wealth, where we were self-sufficient, where we owned our stores, where we owned our property. And they burned them to the ground. So if I played 400 rounds of Monopoly with you and I had to play and give you every dime that I made, and then for 50 years, every time that I played, if you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it, how can you win? How can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. So when they say, why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. There's a social contract that we all have, that if you steal or if I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. So the social contract is broken. You broke the contract when you killed us in the streets. You broke the contract when for 400 years we played your game and built your wealth. You broke the contract when we built our wealth again on our own by our bootstraps in Tulsa, and you dropped bombs on us. When we built it in Rosewood and you came in and you slaughtered us. You broke the contract.
So in some ways, that's our mission. We have to change and, shift the social contract that Kimberly was talking about. So for a couple of minutes, I want to bring it home to us, our Japanese American community. The model minority myth, which many of us are familiar with, admits that our communities were victims of racism. But the myth, which says that we're the better minority, goes on to say that our peoples have enjoyed a measure of privilege over the past half century because our particularly quote unquote prudent response to racism. The story goes that our community values and culture of hard work and respectability had a wonderful concurrence with the white Puritan principles that are foundation in America. So how could white supremacy not allow us access to opportunity? But what of the other Black and brown peoples in the racial underclass? This is where the inherent, implicit, unspoken anti-Blackness enters the model minority myth. Basically, as the myth goes in our community, if all the other Black and brown peoples learned to behave as Japanese Americans and other East Asians did, there would be no racism. And the only explanation for not achieving all this are the same superficial and stereotypical racist explanations which blame them. So we're setting up the conversation for our next session because this is kind of half the model minority argument here that is based on essentially anti-Black racism. And something that I think that we will get into next time is how this was created and how this is oftentimes weaponized against our community. So this was the history, but before I give us a little time to talk about this, is that I want to make clear that my target in talking about the model minority myth is not our Japanese Americans community members. While it may be true that there have been some who historically urged us to buy into the myth and express racism themselves, our target is white supremacy. It's white supremacy that created racial stratification and who created the model minority myth in the first place. It's a white supremacy that consigned our ancestors to despise minority, and when it became advantageous, created the myth that we had to adhere to whiteness and created extreme pressure on us and our forebears, traumatized by the incarceration, to make sure that they would adopt it. This is not about disrespecting the actual sacrifices and hard work of our community and their efforts to thrive. By understanding the influence of white supremacy, we can be strong in our identity and recast it to support our true allies in anti-racism. So at this time, I'd like us to process this for 10 minutes and, talk about how does this account help you better understand whiteness, anti-Blackness, and its place in the model minority myth today. So McKenna, if you can go ahead and put us in the breakouts until about 3:26, that would be great. I think the point of this is not only for us to learn, but the idea is for us to cultivate and build our anti-racist identities through this kind of learning. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily, who is going to bring us home here.
All right, thank you everyone for joining our second event. As Dr. Kinoshita said, our next session is on January 9th, so not until the new year. And in that session, we'll be looking at how the model minority myth developed. And we'll trace about how the status of Asian Americans has changed after World War II and the reasons for why this happened. We'll also show that this was not an entirely benevolent development, but instead about how the model minority myth is currently being weaponized against BIPOC communities. And then lastly, in part 4, we are going to discuss the anti-racist traditions in the Asian American community and the connection to JACL activism today. Lastly, we do have an evaluation. It's the same as last time, and we really appreciate any and all feedback you guys have, and we try to incorporate as much as possible into our upcoming sessions. I believe the link will be in the chat. So in addition to any other feedback, if folks could please answer the questions of what does this session make me want to learn, and what might be important for the community to be aware of. Again, thank you guys for joining us for the second session. I think our team will stick around for a couple minutes if anyone has burning questions or comments they wish to make, but we hope to see you in the next session in the new year.